Age of Inventors is a 2 to 4 player game about ideas. You will need to create different inventions and hire different inventors to help you create those inventions. Each player will play as a scientist with a double-sided player board known as their lab, with an asymmetrical ability on each side. The goal of the game is to be the best scientist after 4 rounds. The way to do this is by gaining the most amount of victory points. So the player who has the best ideas and who can combo their abilities from the inventors and inventions will sure be the victor. So, put your lab coats on, it's time to start inventing. Let me show you Age of Inventors. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name's Clayton and today we are talking about Age of Inventors that is currently on Kickstarter. In this video, I'll be giving you my thoughts and opinions about the game, but please keep in mind everything that you're seeing is in prototype form. Now with that out of the way, let me give you a brief overview about how this game plays and then we'll jump to my final thoughts so you can judge if this game is right for you. Each player is going to be starting with their own unique player board, and each player board is different in the sense that everyone will have different starting resources and where they're going to start on the Invention Unity track, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the video. Once players have picked their player board, each player will also start with one of each of the starting resources: chemistry, physics, engineering. And then everyone will get a light bulb, and this is known as an idea. Each player also starts with 5 funds, which is indicated by spinning the gear icon on their player board. This is how you're going to be keeping track of your funds. After that, the players gain the extra resources based on what's stated on their player board. Some players may gain some extra light bulbs, some extra funds, or other resources. Players will also start with 2 inventions and 1 inventor. There are 2 phases to follow during a round: the upkeep phase and the player phase. Because this is the first round, you skip right to 6, which means drafting your lab equipment. And this will determine turn order for the round. And you do that by drafting equipment tiles, which are located here. The number of equipment tiles placed out each game is based off player count plus 1. The player who gets to go first is determined by the Invention Unity track. In this example, red would go first because they are the highest up on the Invention Unity track. So what they would do is then take the red watch icon and pick a spot on the equipment tiles of which one they would like to use for the round. So for example, let's say he wants to get a lot of light bulbs, so he would pick the light bulb one, simply by placing his red icon there. Once players purchase an equipment tile, it is then placed on their player board, covering up one of the 4 slots. Once they place a tile in that slot, they receive the ability that is underneath. In this example, red would put it here and they would get 1 engineering plus 4 funds, earning back any funds that they've spent. And then the other players would do the same. Once all the players have done that, this would determine the turn order. So example, blue went with the highest and they would have to spend 3 funds. That means they get to go first. You always go from left to right. Red would go second and they would have spent 1 fund, and purple would go last, but they didn't have to spend any funds. So it really just goes based off your strategy and where do you want to end up going first. After that is activating your lab equipment. So you would activate all the lab tile icons that are on your player board. So in this example, red would receive 1 light bulb. But this would grow over time because each round you'll be adding a new equipment tile, helping you gain more resources faster towards the end of the game. Then players will move to the player phase. Now comes the fun part, and players can now start playing down tiles. So in this example, blue gets to go first, and in order to play any invention down, they have to have an inventor down first. Now, in order to place any tile down, you must first pay the resources that is stated on the left-hand side. And then once it's placed, you gain what's on the right-hand side. The difference between inventions and inventor tiles is the ability of the tile. The inventions ability goes off right away, and you are not allowed to place any lab assistants on inventions, only inventors. So what happens when you build an inventor? Let's say blue builds this right away. They pay an engineering to the supply. They gain 3 ideas. I'll talk more about how ideas work in the game later on, but then they also get to place their color book on there. So where's that? Blue. So blue would put their book on there, symboling that is his inventor that he hired. And that actually would cost a switch. So in this game, you have switches and lab assistants. Your lab assistants can go on certain parts on the board, which I'll talk about in a moment. But generally, to do most of your actions, it's gonna cost you a switch. To take an inventor costs a switch. To take an invention is gonna cost you a switch. To build anything is gonna cost you a switch. It's all listed on this handy dandy reference sheet that every player has, which is great because it can be confusing on what you can use for a switch and what costs a lab assistance. But in this example, it's gonna cost 1 switch to build the Wright brothers. And every player has 4 switches and every player has 4 lab assistants, giving them a possibility of 8 actions per round, depending on how they use. Another thing that only blue player can do is because they built the Wright brothers, they can use that inventor's ability, which is on their card, and no other player can. So for example, what the Wright brothers says is you may place any inventor against another inventor as long as you don't retire them, which I'll explain retiring an inventor later on, but this is actually a pretty good ability because there is restrictions when it comes to building inventors. You cannot have two inventors touching one another. It is now the red player's turn and they have to decide what they want to do, and they can actually do a number of different things. For example, now that there is an inventor on the board, they could take their lab assistant and place it on there for their ability. With the Wright brothers ability, it is actually trained any 1 resources for any 2 resources. Keep in mind, resources are engineering, physics, and chemistry, not ideas. Which is actually not that bad of a play. But because this is not their inventor, it is the blue player's inventor, they would have to pay that resource to that player. But then they would gain any of the 2 resources from the supply. So example, he has an engineering, he might want chemistry. So he'd return this to the supply and get 2 chemistry. Which actually isn't that bad of a move because now no other player can place their lab assistant on there and take that ability for the rest of the round. A few other things that the red player could have done is maybe buy an inventor, which I highly recommend to pay attention to because some of these inventors have some sweet abilities, such as Albert Einstein. He allows you to use 2 switches instead of 1 when you activate a switch. So you could build an inventor and then an invention right after him if you have the resources to do so. So let's say, for example, he did that instead. So let's return those 2 things. He get that back. And so instead of placing a lab assistant, he would then just decide to use a switch, pay the 6 funds, and he would gain Albert Einstein, placing him in one of the 3 slots on his player board. Keep in mind, you should already start with an inventor, so this would go in the 2nd slot. You can actually only hold 3 inventors, and if you decide to gain a 4th one, you simply choose which one you want to discard, and you just no longer gain that ability if that inventor is built. Some other places on the board you can place your lab assistants are either on the free resource spot, where you can gain any 1 resource of your choice, or on your lab equipment tiles on your player board. Here, you can pay funds to reset the invention tiles or the inventor cards. You can place your lab assistants here to move up on the ingenuity track. Remember, this can be worth victory points at the end of the game, depending where you are. You move up by spending ideas, and they can help you gain funds each round, and it also helps you pick first when it comes to drafting those lab equipment tiles, which again determines turn order. Alright, now it is the purple player's turn, and let's say they wanted to build an invention, so I can show you how this works. So purple player has 2 starting inventions, and they are gonna decide which one they want to play first. For example, let's say they wanted to play this one first. Again, paying the cost, which is on the left hand side, so paying an engineering and a physics to the supply. So for example, this tile would have to go next to an inventor of the same color, matching one of the edge of the colors. So the Wright brothers happens to be all orange, so it doesn't really matter where they go. So as long as it is placed on one side, it's good to go. So then purple player would gain the ability which is on the right, which means move up on the green track. So they would move up 1 on the green track. So I just want to take a quick second to explain these tracks before resolving the rest of this tile, because these tracks are the main way to gain victory points in the game. In fact, if you're not moving up on these tracks at all, the chances of you winning the game are slim to none. As you can see on the left hand side, it'll tell you at the end of the game, if you're the highest up on the track, you gain 8 victory points, second would gain 4, third would gain 2, and last place would gain 1 victory point. Also, once you pass or land on any symbol on the track, you gain the effect of that symbol. Some are draw inventors or inventions, things like that. So it's very important to be first place in at least one of these tracks if you stand a chance of winning. There are other ways to gain victory points, such as where you finish on the ingenuity track. Also, when you retire an inventor, you get to draw victory points from the bag, which could be 1, 2, or 3. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Another way to gain victory points is by buying these experiment notes, and they'll tell you how many resources it costs at the end of the game to have left over to gain victory points. But as you can tell, most of these only give you 1, 2, or 3, which is not as many as you would gain on these tracks. So overall, those are 4 ways to gain victory points. Now that purple is on the track, and they are currently the highest one, they gain the metal that is in that track. So they would gain the green metal. Each metal represents a different resource. So green will represent chemistry, I do believe. And now that they have this, they can use chemistry as a wild for any other resources. So either as engineering or as physics. So they hang on to that until someone passes them on the board. Now that they have placed this tile and they moved up on the track and you resolve that, it is now time to look at the tiles ability, which each one will have a different ability. This symbol means that that player can now play another tile that costs one less resource. So this is really cool because that means they can now place 2 tiles. So for this example, they want to build this invention, but because it costs 1 less resource, they can just simply pick whatever one they want. Let's say they had a physics left over, and now they can build 2 inventions in 1 turn. So then they can place this down and gain that ability, but they cannot place it here. They would have to either place it here, 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 or here, because it has to be at least touching an inventor of the same color. So they decided to place it here, and then again, they would move up on the track. And then they would also gain that ability. This ability means draw an invention. So they would draw an invention into their hand. After that, players would continue taking turns back and forth, either choosing to place a lab assistant or using a switch. Once players can no longer play anymore, they can pass on the turn by flipping over their reference card to the upkeep phase. And then you'd follow the steps and rinse and repeat. Players would continue to do this back and forth and moving up on the track until the end of the 4th round. If you ever needed to purchase more inventions, you simply use a switch and pay that amount of ideas to purchase one of the 3 available inventions. At any point during the game, if an inventor is fully surrounded by tiles, they are now retired. If you are the player who placed the last tile to surround the inventor, you get to draw a victory point gear token from the bag. This is kept secret until the end of the game. Next, that player must discard that inventor card because they can no longer use that inventor's ability. Return the book to that player and that inventor is now retired and no player can place their lab assistants on that inventor anymore. Alright, now that you kind of understand how this game plays, it's now time to decide if this game is right for you. My personal thoughts and opinions is this game is very competitive, where you are going to be fighting over these 3 tracks to gain the victory points. If you're not at least in first place in one of them, you're definitely not going to win the game. There is a little bit of take that in the game where you're going to try to be blocking each other off when you're going to be playing different inventions, trying to retire each other's inventors. There's abilities that allow you to steal other resources from other players. I love the theme and how the artwork works with it. I love these little light bulbs called ideas, which makes sense because it ties in really well with the theme. If you have an idea for an invention, you spend your ideas to get a new invention. You hire scientists or inventors to help you by spending funds. There's tons of things to think about in this game. Tons of replayability here. There's even events in the game that I didn't really talk about, and each event is unique with 2 different effects. The players get to vote on which effect they want for the round. Events can either be good for players or bad. I actually found this plays best at 2 or 3 players. In my opinion, I actually played this really fast at 2 players, around 25 minutes to 30 minutes, which is good because if you just want to fill a game and you want to play 2 players in half hour, here you go. Although with 4 players, it gets a lot more competitive because the board fills up a lot faster and you really want to get your inventions down so you're the one that's moving up. So again, there's tons of things to focus on. One negative thing I did experience at 2 player though, because there's not that many players, I found it a little bit harder to get resources. The main way to get resources is going to be either on your player board or by playing them on inventors that are on the board. But because you're only playing with 2 players, there's not a lot of inventors that are on the board right away. With 3 to 4 players, there's going to be a bunch of inventors that get played down right away, so you have a bunch of different options to get resources. But in any case, there's always this spot on the player board to get you any one resource that you want. When it comes to the iconography, I kind of wish there was a reference sheet that I could easily look at, just like how there's 2 phases for the game. Help tell me what each ability is, because I found I was always constantly referring back to the rulebook, double checking that the ability did what I thought it did. That has been Age of Inventors. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, make sure to check out my latest video where I talk about my top 10 board game coffee tables, which you can find right here, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Take care.